November 30th, 1940. A cargo ship cuts through the cold Baltic waters, carrying something the United States military had already given up on: 44 aircraft. American fighters, the kind the U.S. Navy had decided were failures, the kind they were happy to sell off as quickly as possible. But the men who were about to receive them had no other choice. Finland was desperate. The Soviet Air Force was bombing their cities and outnumbering their pilots 2-1, and they were about to turn the plane, America, rejected, into something that would haunt Soviet pilots for the next 4 years. This is the story of the worst fighter of WWII that Finland turned into a killer. The Brewster Buffalo wasn't supposed to be a failure. When it first flew in 1937, it looked like the future: an all-metal monoplane with a retractable landing gear and an enclosed cockpit. Modern, fast for its time. The U.S. Navy believed it would be their next great fighter. But as production ramped up and pilots climbed into the cockpit, something became clear. The plane had serious problems. It was underpowered. It couldn't climb like the fighters it would face in the Pacific. It was slow to dive. Its combat record in American hands would be disastrous. The Marines lost 13 out of 20 Buffaloes at Midway. That single battle became the defining moment in American memory. The Buffalo wasn't just a failure. It became the symbol of American aircraft design at its worst. By 1942, the U.S. Navy had stopped flying them. They shipped the remaining aircraft to training squadrons and tried to forget the whole program ever existed. But for Finland, the Buffalo was exactly what they needed at exactly the moment they needed it. Finland had just survived the Winter War. From November 1939 to March 1940, the Soviet Union invaded. The Finns fought with incredible courage and determination. They fought so well that the world believed they might actually stop the Red Army, but the Soviets kept sending more men, more tanks, more planes. After 3 months of brutal combat, Finland was forced to make peace. They lost territory, they lost soldiers, and they were left with a terrible certainty: the Soviets would be back. The Finnish Air Force knew exactly how outmatched they were. They had older fighters, Fokker biplanes, aircraft that were already becoming obsolete when military planners in Helsinki looked at what the Soviets had. They saw a force that had been tested in Spain and China, Soviet pilots who had combat experience, and the Finns knew that if war came again, they would be facing that same air force with equipment that simply couldn't compete. In April of 1939, even before the Winter War began, Finnish officials had started quietly approaching foreign suppliers. They looked at 3 options. Grumman offered the F-4F Wildcat, the same fighter that would go on to defend Pearl Harbor. Seversky offered an export version of their P-35, and Brewster offered their brand new naval fighter, the F2A. The Grumman planes weren't available yet. Sweden had bought up all the Seversky aircraft, so Finland's only option was the Brewster Buffalo. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the choice any Air Force would have picked if everything had been available. Buti was the only fighter the Finns could actually get their hands on. The contract was signed on December 16, 1939. 44 aircraft, V, at $54,000 each. 3 days later, the Soviets invaded Poland. 4 days later, the Winter War began. The Buffaloes wouldn't arrive in Finland until late 1940. By then, the armistice was already signed. The planes came at the worst possible moment. They were too late to defend against the first Soviet invasion, but they arrived. just in time for everyone to understand what was coming next. A second war was inevitable, and this time Finland would be ready. But the aircraft that arrived in Finland were not the same aircraft the U.S. Navy had. Rejected. They weren't designed for carrier operations. They didn't have arrestor hooks. They weren't equipped with U.S. Navy weapons or navigation gear. The guns had been removed. The gun sights were missing. The instruments were civilian grade, not military. U.S. regulations required that Finland wouldn't receive Navy equipment, so the aircraft came completely stripped down. It was almost as if the U.S. military was saying, "You want these failures? Fine. But you're going to have to rebuild them yourself." And that's exactly what the Finnish Air Force did. December 1940. Finnish technicians opened the crates and looked at what they'd been. They stripped down Soviet weapon systems from captured aircraft. They installed Finnish-designed gun sights. They improvised instruments from whatever they could find. They modified engines. They reinforced fuselages. Within weeks, the rejected American fighters were becoming something new, something Finnish, something dangerous. The Polikarpov the First 16 was their first opponent. The Soviets had sent hundreds of them, older fighters, limited range, butt-fasten, a dive, maneuverable. The kind of aircraft that had proven itself in Spain. Soviet pilots had real combat experience. Finnish pilots were about to be tested in ways they'd never been before. January 1941. The first patrol. A Finnish Buffalo pilot climbs into the cockpit. He doesn't have the luxury of training. He doesn't have the comfort of knowing his blaze. Aircraft inside and out. What he has is desperation. His country depends on him. His nation is facing an enemy that outnumbers them. And as he pushes the throttle forward and the engine roars to life, something unexpected happens. The Buffalo responds. It climbs. It turns. It doesn't move like the American Navy pilots said it would. It doesn't feel like a failure. It feels like a chance. The first Soviet fighter appears on the horizon. Two sides of the same moment. One moment the sky is empty. The next moment, two aircraft are moving toward each other at incredible speed. Guns fire. Tracers cut across the sky. And then, just like that, the Soviet fighter is falling. Smoke trailing behind it. The pilot knows immediately this isn't what anyone predicted. Spring of 1941. The kill count starts to climb. One Soviet fighter. Then two. Then three. The news travels through Finnish squadrons. The Buffalo isn't a failure. It's effective. Against early Soviet models, it's devastating. Finnish pilots are reporting something that contradicts everything the American Navy had experienced. The aircraft they had rejected was winning. Again and again. Day after day. By the summer of 1941, the numbers were becoming undeniable. 32. Soviet aircraft destroyed for every Buffalo lost. 3-1, 4-1, 5-1. The 2 ratio kept getting better. And as the ratio improved, something else happened. Pilots began to be distinguished from the ordinary. One pilot would return with 2 kills, then 4, then 6. The Finns started tracking who their best pilots were, who had the most victories, who had the best instincts in a dogfight. The Finnish Air Force was producing aces at a rate that shocked everyone watching. 36 pilots would eventually achieve ace status flying the Brewster 36 in an Air Force that started the war with only a handful of modern fighters. The secret wasn't the aircraft. By 1942, American spare parts stopped arriving. Finland was at war with the Soviet Union. which was now an ally of the United States. No supplies came from the West. No new engines. No replacement parts. Nothing. The Buffalo pilots were flying in an aircraft that was already obsolete, now becoming impossible to keep airborne through any conventional means. Finnish mechanics became something unprecedented. They became inventors. They scoured wreck sites looking for usable parts. They stripped components from captured Soviet aircraft. They used pieces from Soviet engines to keep American engines running. They improvised. They adapted. They rebuilt. A Bulgarian mechanic might take parts from a wrecked I-16 and somehow make them work on a Brewster engine. A Finnish engineer might look at a broken ammunition loading system and design something that worked better than the original. The aircraft became a hybrid of American design, Soviet components, and Finnish improvisation. It was no longer purely Brewster's aircraft. It was theirs. The continuation war would last until 1944. For 3 years, the Brewster Buffalo flew in the Arctic skies, facing waves of Soviet attacks, outnumbered, outgunned, in terms of raw numbers, but never outmatched in the air. The kill ratio would hold 32-1 in the first phase of combat. The ratio would shift slightly as the Soviets brought better aircraft, the I-153, newer variants of the I-16, but the Finns kept winning. They kept flying. They kept fighting in an aircraft that no one had believed in. October 1944. Finland signs an armistice with the Soviet Union. The war is over. The Brewster Buffaloes fly their last combat missions, and as the aircraft line up in their final formation, one thing is absolutely clear. The worst fighter of the Second World War had become one of the most successful. The aircraft that America had discarded as a failure had been vindicated in the one place where it mattered most, in actual combat. But the question that haunts this story is the real one. How did a plane that failed so catastrophically in American hands become unstoppable in Finnish hands? The answer isn't about aircraft design. It isn't about engines or wings or ammunition capacity. It's about something much more fundamental. It's about who was flying it. It's about desperation turned into skill. It's about a small nation facing an existential threat and doing something remarkable with the tools they had available. The U.S. Navy pilots who flew the Buffalo in the Pacific expected to win. They had every advantage, modern training, superior numbers, the best resources a modern military could provide. But some of them lost. Some of them died in an aircraft they believed was inferior. The Finnish pilots who flew the same aircraft believed they had to win. They knew that if they lost, their nation might cease to exist. They flew with the knowledge that their families depended on them. They flew with the understanding that there was no backup plan, no second chance, no reserve of better aircraft waiting in a factory back home. That desperation became their greatest weapon. 36 Finnish aces. 36 pilots whose names were recorded in history because they flew an aircraft that wasn't supposed to work, because they took a plane that America had rejected and proved that in the right hands, with the right determination, with the willingness to improvise and adapt and fight harder than anyone expected, a failure could become a legend. The Brewster Buffalo was retired in 1948. Finland kept some of them in service, but the age of combat flying for the aircraft had ended. Most were eventually scrapped. Some survived as museum pieces, but the legacy was already written. In the Arctic skies over Finland and Karelia, above the frozen lakes and snow-covered forests, the worst fighter of WWII had become a killer, and the pilots who flew it had proven something that transcends the history of military aviation. Sometimes the machine doesn't matter. Sometimes it's the will to survive, the willingness to improvise, the courage to face an enemy that outnumbers you and still fly into the fight day after day, knowing that your nation depends on the outcome. That's what the Brewster Buffalo represents. Not an aircraft, a moment where desperation became excellence. Now, here's what I want to know. Do you think that kind of underdog victory in the air could happen today? Would modern technology and training ever allow a supposedly inferior aircraft to dominate against conventional expectations? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Hit that like button to help YouTube recommend this channel to more history lovers just like you. Because stories like the Finnish Buffaloes deserve to be heard by people who understand that history isn't just about the dates and the numbers. It's about the people who live through the impossible moments. Next time, we're going to look at another American aircraft that the U.S. military underestimated. A fighter plane so controversial that some pilots refused to fly it, yet it became the most requested fighter in the entire Soviet Air Force. The Soviets loved it more than America ever did. If you want to see how that machine rewrote the rules of air combat, subscribe now so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching.